What's the first step in kind of getting toward meaningful work?
The first step really for most people, if you want to be able to create that on a sustained basis, is self-inquiry and self-knowledge. Do you understand who you are, what fills you up, what empties you out, what your deep values are, what your strengths are, what your sort of identity is, what your preferences are, your orientations. So you really understand these are the things that fill me up and empty me out. And then, you turn that out into the world and you look for things that essentially align as closely as possible with sort of the key elements about you.
I study the patterns of the universe.
Advancement in the brain.
Virtual your mind. Talking about your life, fundamental principles, philosophy.
What is and what is not true.
Those who know themselves.
Being better every single day.
Well, hello there, and welcome to another episode of the Think Grow podcast, where personal development meets real life. I'm your host, Ruben Chavez, and I explore a variety of topics with thought leaders, creators, scientists, and all sorts of interesting people with the goal to bring you different perspectives you can use to enrich your mind and improve your life in whatever way you see fit. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Jonathan Fields. A lot of you might recognize that name. Jonathan identifies first and foremost as a dad and a husband, but professionally, he's an award-winning author, serial entrepreneur, and master teacher. He's founded a number of game-changing wellness companies and led workshops around the world on everything from yoga and mindfulness to conscious entrepreneurship and innovation. His most recent book is called How to Live a Good Life, Soulful Stories, Surprising Science, and Practical Wisdom. It's a great book. Highly recommend you check it out. Super inspiring. Currently, Jonathan runs the mission-driven media and education company, Good Life Project, where he produces a top-rated podcast of the same name with millions and millions of downloads. I've actually had the honor of appearing on his podcast, and that's actually how we first connected. Jonathan regularly keynote speaks at events, and he's been featured in a bunch of media outlets, everything from the New York Times to USA Today, People, O Magazine, Vogue, Wall Street Journal, Fast Company, and on and on and on. The guy's everywhere. But more than anything, Jonathan is literally one of the most genuine, kindest, and down-to-earth guys you could ever meet. I'm extremely lucky to call him a friend. We had a really fun conversation, and interesting conversation, I hope. We cover topics such as doing meaningful work and his philosophy when it comes to that. We talk about the value of psychological and personality frameworks like the 5 love languages. We talk about his views on bridging the gap between science and spirituality. I ask him about his approach to learning a new subject, which I think a lot of you will find helpful. And we talk about much more. So without further ado, I will let you get to listening. I give you Jonathan Fields. Jonathan, thank you for being here, man.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Yeah. Well, it's been a while since we've really caught up, I guess, but you're one of the few Instagram friends that I have met in real life. There's only a handful of those. I guess we met like 2 years ago when I was on your podcast. I guess it was May of 2016 when I was on your podcast.
Yeah, no, it's great. It's always fun when something starts online and then at some point you meet the person and then it ends up turning into a friendship. It's like it doesn't happen all that often, but when it does and you just click face to face, it's always great.
Yeah, totally. I think one of the first memories I have of interacting with you, I don't know why I'm remembering this now, but it was you recommending the book Quiet to me, which is basically a book about introverts. So I don't know what you intuited about me, like right off the bat, like this dude needs to read this book. But that was like one of the first things I remember. But that's an awesome book. And I think we also have that in common too, is that I think we would probably both describe ourselves as introverted. Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think introverts can sniff out other introverts a little bit easier also. It's just kind of like you kind of recognize certain patterns in the way that people interact with the world. But I think I'm also kind of fascinated with people who have these, like really big sort of public social profiles, but who also are like on a personal and on a sort of like a social wiring level, they're not big and public facing. They actually love quiet time. They like to hang out with one or two or just a small number of good friends and family. So I'm always fascinated by how people dance with that.
Yeah, me too. I mean, I think the whole just framework of like personality types and temperaments, looking at those from like a psychological standpoint is, I think, so helpful. Like I love frameworks just in general. Things like, for instance, the 5 love languages, which I want to talk with you about because I know you wrote about that in your book. But these kind of frameworks are so helpful just for understanding ourselves and then for understanding other people. I think it's just fascinating, but also endlessly practical.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think in terms of frameworks very often also, because to me, a framework it's kind of like a big word. So to me, when I think about framework, it's just a decision-making tool. Like it's something that helps me decide what to say yes or no to in life. And in my mind, anything that does that is awesome. And anything that sort of lets me spend a little bit less sort of cognitive bandwidth understanding who I am and how to relate to other people, that's always helpful too, which is sort of like, like the types. I'm curious what you think about this too. I often wonder if there's a risk in those also. And like, I think it's really good to understand, if you take a personality type of thing that, this is sort of like one person or researcher's perspective, and it's not determinative. Like if you feel strongly after you get your type that this really doesn't represent who I am, like go with your gut, like don't go with what you're being told.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I like frameworks in the sense that they are a good rule of thumb. And I mean, they're not the end all be all, but they can at least, point you in the right direction, I guess. Of what the truth is. I think the frameworks that I gravitate to most are those that have been pretty well researched. And I mean, yes, maybe they are one perspective, but it's a result of, say the scientific method where they've deduced from a lot of different sources and there's been a lot of collaboration. Like, for instance, are you familiar with the Big 5 personality traits?
Yeah, sure. Yep.
And I mean, so that kind of a thing is really helpful too. Like that's another approach. And so like these are kind of like tools in the toolbox, that you can kind of grab from and be like, how do I compare within the framework of the Big 5 personality traits? And then also, how do I compare in, let's say, the Myers-Briggs type indicator? You gauge those against each other, and then it's like, okay, well, now I have a better understanding of where I fit on the spectrum here.
Yeah, no, totally agree. I think they just, each one gives you a little bit of a hint, and then you can take bits and pieces. It's kind of funny that you bring this up because I've actually been working on an archetyping system for meaningful work for a number of years now. And it's based in part on all the work that we've done with entrepreneurs and all the work we've done with sort of like thousands of other people, just kind of asking the question, what should I do with my life? And when they ask me that question in particular, what they're really asking me is, how do I find and do work that's deeply meaningful to me and where I feel fully expressed and connected to a sense of purpose and flow? So what I start to realize is, after sort of working with a lot of data sets of people, is that there are sort of distinct identities along a spectrum there that, again, the same thing, that you can kind of shorthand it and let people understand a lot more about themselves and what they need about the way they contribute to the world to really feel nourished. That's just a helpful tool. So it's been one of my geek projects for a number of years now, and we're actually soon to be sharing those with the world. So
that's really interesting. I actually want to get into that more. I think I want to first maybe take a small step back, and I also want to discuss kind of the temperaments more and how your particular temperament and kind of personality type interfaces with what you do. But before that, I kind of want to just give our listeners some background as to like what you do, like how you describe what you do to others, and maybe kind of just a big history type of trajectory of your kind of path or your career.
Yeah, sure. So it's funny. Whenever I'm asked to give a bio, I always start it with, I'm a dad and a husband, and then I'm an entrepreneur and an author and all these things, because to me, that is my primary function in the world. That's where I give the most and I get the most back. That's sort of like the truest part of my identity. But, if you kind of zoom the lens back a chunk of years, I was the lemonade stand kid. I was the one who was always kind of figuring out ways to make things or to do things and make a little bit of money here and there. But I was also just a fierce maker. I love to create stuff. I love the process of going from nothing to something, which is for some people is the most terrifying part of any process. For me, it's like, give me a blank canvas or a blank white page or like, the back of a napkin, and I'm the happiest person in the world.
Mm-hmm.
So I started just building different things. And I was also really interested in mind, body, wellness, movement. I was a gymnast. I trained as a competitive gymnast for the first 20 years or so of my life.
Oh, wow. I did not know
And
that.
then, when I got into college, I started a company. I also love music. It's been a lifelong passion. So I was a DJ. I was a club DJ, and we built music, like a sound, lighting, and DJ company where we were out at clubs, doing all sorts of different things. And it was really fascinating because that started to get me really fascinated in social psychology as well, because I started to realize that being one person behind turntables for 4 hours, I could control the social interaction of like hundreds of people for hours at a time. And it was so fascinating to see how I could literally, like, I know if I choose this song at 128 beats per minute, this is going to happen. And if I drop it down to this other song at 98 beats per minute, we're going to go here. And I could take people on this sort of like collective journey. And that's always stayed with me in a large sort of like way. And I've realized more recently that that's been a through line in a lot of what I've done. So anyway, I made a really weird left turn and went to law school after that. Ended up graduating and then practicing law for the better part of 5 years until essentially I was working for weeks on end without, barely going home, barely ever sleeping, eating horrible food, crazy amounts of stress. My immune system pretty much cratered, and I developed a huge abscess, a huge infection in the center of my body that ate a hole through my intestines from the outside in and sent me into the hospital into emergency surgery.
Wow.
And I kind of knew at that moment that was a wake-up call for me. I was like, when your body is physically rejecting your career, you got to do something about that. It's like, so I knew I was on my way out at that point, but I also knew that at that point I was, I had a power job, I had a plum position, I was making tons of money, and I didn't really want to take a big hit. So I spent the better part of the year plotting my next move and saving up a ton of money because I knew pretty quickly it was going to take me back into the world of entrepreneurship and wellness.
Mm-hmm.
So I left there, and my next move out of there was making $12 an hour as a personal trainer because I wanted to learn the fitness industry from the ground up.
Yeah.
I wanted to understand what was happening, what was working and what wasn't. And I learned pretty quickly there was massive dysfunction in the industry on a club level, on a service provider level, and pretty quickly went out on my own and built my first facility myself. And we built that into a sort of thriving training center. And after about 2.5 years, sold that to an investor group. It took a little bit of time to start writing, which kind of was just a flicker in my eye back then.
Mm-hmm.
And I got interested in yoga also, the personal practice. And then I pretty quickly got interested. It's like the entrepreneur sort of like side of my brain just constantly sees possibility.
Yeah.
And I was like, this is a really interesting world. There are a ton of people who are stressing out of their minds. And especially I'm in New York City. So there's, it's like ground zero for stress. And there were great yoga studios, but there were also places where you'd walk in and there was incense and weird music and you had to take your shoes off and nobody could pronounce the words. And I was like, coming from where I was coming from, if you took your average middle-aged professional who was out of shape, sedentary, self-conscious, and they walked into that room, they would just run screaming in the other direction. I was like, I need to create something that actually was welcoming to them. So I actually opened a yoga studio where the idea was to create a space that preserved the power of the practice, but lowered barriers to entry for sort of like a mainstream market of humanity. I actually signed a lease for a floor in a building in New York City, a 6-year lease with a home, married with a 3-month-old baby the day before 9/11 here. Woke up the next day and it was just devastation everywhere you looked. And of course, my first thought was, who did I lose? Because everybody knew somebody who was gone that day if you were in New York. And the next thought was, am I really going to do this? Am I going to launch a business? And a couple of different things happened that made me realize that this was the time to do it. And we moved ahead with it. And it ended up being this really powerful, beautiful community. So it grew into not just a flourishing company that was, financially very successful, but a really beautiful business. It's kind of funny in the background, you can hear a siren now proving, yes, I am in New York City. And I trained to teach yoga. So, I became one of our early teachers. And then eventually we grew to a staff of, a lot of people, a lot of teachers and a huge community. And that was an incredible sort of window in my life. And I did that for 7 years. And eventually my entrepreneurial side and other stuff started getting hold of me again. And I sold that company and stepped aside and started really focusing on writing and building community differently. And I came out with my first book. So now I'm 3 books in. And now in 2012, we launched this company called Good Life Project. What that is essentially it's a media and education venture. So we have a beautiful global community. We produce a podcast, and for the first couple of years, we were producing a video series as well. And we also produce a giant summer camp for grown-ups that people come hang out with. So right now, that's kind of my focus. I write books, I speak, I produce podcasts, and make all sorts of other stuff. We also, on the educational side of what we do, we've run all sorts of trainings and programs to help people really either as entrepreneurs build conscious companies that are aligned with who they are, and as people are just trying to figure out that question we were talking about earlier, how do I do meaningful work in the world, to help them through that process. And that's kind of how I spend my day. And a couple of years ago, my wife joined me in the company as well. So now we work side by side, and it's kind of amazing.
That is amazing. There's so much there that I want to dive into, but
I know. Sorry, that was the long version.
I loved it. I mean, you have such a kind of a varied and a rich career background in a lot of ways. It spans different fields. And I mean, that's so fascinating to me when people do work that spans disciplines. That's so fascinating. Like Susan Cain, she talks about in her TED Talk, the author of Quiet, she was this introvert trying to be an extrovert, and she ended up being a Wall Street lawyer. And I just think that's so interesting when people kind of step outside of the mold. I was going to ask you, because you kind of alluded to it, I was going to ask you if there is a common denominator among your various kind of ventures. And I think you mentioned there was social psychology. Is there other ones? And if not, can you kind of elaborate on how you bring that into what you do and why you're interested in that?
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of through lines for me that I've really been able to kind of reflect on looking back. So one of them is social psychology. And it's understanding what makes people tick, understanding largely what makes people take action, and how can I create something that in some way moves people. So it's sort of like the sweet spot between those two things. So part of it is understanding sort of human dynamics and social interaction, especially on almost like a larger crowd level. Mm-hmm. And the other part is just a hardcore maker. I love to create things. So I worked with my hands as a kid. I was a painter when I was a kid also, which I didn't share with you. Completely self-taught, and probably largely not great at it, but I love doing it. I made my walking around money in high school painting album covers on jean jackets back when album covers were a thing.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And I've worked construction and summer jobs in college, and I've always loved to make stuff. And in the early days, it was a lot of physical making with my hands. And now, I make companies, I make programs, I make experiences, I craft podcasts, I make books. But I love that process of making things that in some way move people. So for me, that's been a really consistent through line. And to do that, I need to understand what moves people. So, those sort of feed off of each other.
That's fascinating. I totally relate to you on...
You're kind of similar from what I know.
Yeah, I mean, every time you talk, I want to keep saying, me too. I think we share a lot of common traits and a lot of tendencies. One of the things is you describe yourself as an autodidact, which is a fun word to say, but just a fancy way of saying you're self-taught and you learn best when you can learn at your own pace and, study on your own, which is me to a T. I was fairly lukewarm about school. I didn't go to college because, I did for a couple semesters of community college, but it was too restrictive for me. I didn't really define it like that at the time. At the time, I was just I don't want to do it. Now, looking back, I know that it's because of my learning style. I'm so fascinated with a lot of different subjects, and so I tend to my curiosity gets away from me sometimes. I wanted to ask you, as kind of an autodidact / introvert maybe, what methods do you use when you are, let's say, approaching a subject? Because I know you're very well read and you also have a lot of varied interests. What are your methods for learning? Let's say you approach a new subject. Do you just read a book? Are there other more tactile things that you do? How do you approach that?
I think there are probably 2 key things for me. One is, first for me is, I open Google and I just madly search for anything I can find. I'll read any book I can find on a particular thing. I'll listen to any podcast I can find on it. I'll do whatever I can to devour information. And that feeds into the second thing, which is I found over the years, I didn't really realize I was doing this until fairly recently, is that I'm also really focused on getting as close to the primary source of knowledge as I can possibly get. So back when I was learning yoga, I wasn't super attracted to learning from younger teachers. I was looking for the oldest person I could possibly find who was doing it as long as possible, who learned from, an original master in India. If that original master was still alive, like, could I find them and study with them? Because I wanted the least amount of filtering possible. And I wanted direct access to the people who had the primary knowledge and doing the primary research. And I find that I love to devour science also and study research reports because, I don't necessarily want the people who've written articles about it or books about it as much as I want to go into the experimental design so I can assess, in my mind, is this valid? Where did they go? And read the critiques of the science and stuff like that. And I realize I'm very likely an outlier and a total dork when it comes to that stuff, but that's the way that my mind works. So I'm constantly seeking people who are masters. I'll give you kind of an interesting example coming up. So I said I'm a maker and I used to make a lot of stuff with my hands and I love the process of working with my hands to create stuff, but I haven't for a while and I've really been missed it. And I also play guitar really badly, but I love the form and the shape of guitars and I love working with wood too. So I've just committed to a month-long intensive guitar building experience where me and a buddy are going to be going out and basically, staying with and living with this master luthier and working 10 hours a day in his workshop with him, only two of us. So it's not like a big classroom setting. It's really largely individualized and learning, like in a hands-on way. We'll be working side by side with this person who has been building, guitars and beautiful instruments for decades so that I can get direct access to people like that. I think in no small part, that's a lot of what fuels Your Life Project, the podcast too, is it gives me access to those people. So when I sit down with a guest, I'm not just interviewing them, we're having a conversation and I'm asking the questions that I'm really curious about so I can learn from these people who I consider, embodied teachers.
That is a great answer. Something stood out there. You mentioned science and how that's a big part of your learning. That is with me too. And just kind of the underlying roots of something, right? Like, I think it's very helpful to understand, like, for example, the biological roots, like in diet, for instance, like why do you gravitate toward high sugary, fatty foods? And you look at how we kind of evolved and it's like, well, we needed to take advantage of these calories whenever we could. So we gorged ourselves and those who did were more apt to survive and passed on their genes. And so now many generations later, we're wired to kind of gorge on calories, right? When we don't need to anymore. But anyway, that's just an example of how, the underlying science can kind of help us figure out how to navigate modern day problems. And I think you're geared a little bit like that too. In your podcast, you have weekly science updates, I think. And I think that's so helpful. And that's fairly unique in, I think, the field of personal development. Is something that I've definitely wanted and have begun incorporating too, because it's just how I think and it anchors concepts for me. I'm curious, you've done a great job at bridging this gap between science and personal development, and you have a spiritual aspect to your work as well, I think. This is kind of a big question that I have that I want to kind of explore throughout this podcast. What are your views on kind of bridging the gap between, let's say, science and spirituality or religion and reason or anything like that? Like, can those be reconciled?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I'm kind of grappling with that myself. So I was brought up sort of Jewish by tradition, but not really by practice. We were a pretty non-religious household. And I've never been deeply religious, but in, the second half of my life, I would consider myself increasingly spiritual and at this point, like very spiritual. And I've had that same question. I've had, okay, so if you're constantly looking for science, for the reason why, for the validated peer-reviewed explanation of phenomena, how can you simultaneously believe in something like God? Even if it's not God for you, even if like some bigger sense of universal source or energy or consciousness that binds us together. And I kept bumping into brilliant people, people who I would read, people who I've spoken with now who are deeply, deeply brilliant academics and practical people in the world, people who've built billion-dollar companies or developed stunning, like validated research in the world, and they are fiercely religious. Dave Evans is a really fascinating guy. He was one of the early employees at Apple and then split off to co-found EA, Electronic Arts, which became one of the giant gaming companies.
Wow.
He was an engineer. So this is a guy who thinks like an engineer and like really, really experienced entrepreneur, incredibly accomplished. And he hit a point in his life where he's like, there's something missing. And he went back and he got a degree in theology. And what he realized is he said, the construct of being a woman or a man or a person of science and being practical and real in the world, warring with the concept of having a larger awareness of consciousness or God or universe, whatever you call it. So it's kind of a modern thing. If you really dive deep into the wisdom of ancient traditions, it actually doesn't conflict all that much. So he's somebody who has deep convictions theologically and religiously and now and spiritually, and also is very practical. He developed a course that he began teaching at Berkeley on designing your life, where he used design thinking and integrated it with sort of a lot of ideas around personal development, and became this massively popular course. And then he went and partnered with a friend of his to offer the course at the D School at Stanford, the design school at Stanford. And it became like this huge course with a wait list. And then everybody who wasn't in the course or in the school wanted to do it. So they're developing it for, sort of mainstream audiences. And it's so interesting to me because I have now met so many people like Dave who are so incredibly brilliant and practical and hands-on process oriented, and at the same time have deep conviction in the existence of something bigger than them that they can't explain, that is not provable, but that they somehow feel and that somehow influences their decisions, and they feel a sense of awe and benefit from and responsibility too. And I think as I've moved sort of further into my life also, I've become increasingly open to the idea of spirituality and something, I don't know if I would use the word God or define it with a name or present it as a being, but I do have a sense that there is some bigger thing that connects us all. There is some universal energy that is bigger than us. And also, I've seen so many times things happen in the world, especially to people, that defy rational explanation, but are repeated so many times, where you look at the phenomenon, you're like, okay, so this has happened. It's happened over and over and over and over. There's no scientific explanation for this. There's no practical explanation for why this happens, yet it's happening. So there's got to be something that we don't know.
What kind of things are you talking about there?
Everything from medical outcomes to, so I've worked with so many entrepreneurs over the years to help them build companies. One of the things that they tend to focus on is, how do I build a brand? How do I market this in a really powerful and effective way so that people are attracted to it? And what I've seen is that the single most powerful form of marketing in the world is aligned presence, meaning if you go inside and you develop a deep self-knowledge of who you are, what matters to you in the world, how you want to contribute to the world in a way that really, really aligns fiercely with the essence of who you are. And then you align your actions in the world with that. There's a level of just like deep coherence that is somehow energetically palpable to other people. They feel it when you walk in a room. They sense it when you're trying to lead them or interacting with them or offer a solution to them in a sales scenario, and they want to be a part of it. You are radiating something that there's no scientific thing that says, okay, so when you align your actions with your essence, like you light up and people want to be in your orbit. I call that being a beacon. And I have seen this phenomenon happen so many times that I just know it to be true, which is why so many times I'll say, stop working on all this other stuff and start working on you and really develop a fierce self-knowledge and then align the way you live in the world and contribute to the world with that. And people will just feel that coherence as radiance and move to you. And if you had asked me 5-10 years ago, if you'd thrown this theory at me, I feel like that's the dopiest thing I've ever heard. But really, having seen this repeated so many times on small levels of, like somebody who just wants to be a blogger or an author or a podcaster, to people who are building big venture-backed companies, to people who are, executives in large companies. I've seen this phenomenon replicated so many times that when people sort of give up the external trappings and really realize that cultivating self-knowledge and developing coherent action changes the energy they radiate into the world in a palpable way, I just know it to be true. So that's kind of like an interesting practical example in a business way.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. There's things that can't be measured, at least right now. Just because it can't be measured with our instruments doesn't mean that it's not a phenomenon that we can't acknowledge. Is that kind of accurate?
Yeah, and clearly there's something bigger. Everyone's going to assign a different name to it, but there is something bigger out there that I feel is universal and energetic that in some way moves through us and connects us, and that we feel. Like I feel a sense of responsibility to community. When you look out into the world, many of the most renowned scientists in history were also, had religious conviction and spiritual and faith-based conviction. Einstein was religious. So when you look at people who are men and women of science and you see, okay, so these are brilliant people who are trained in the scientific, process, and yet they hold space for the unknown, for the mystical. You're like, they're really, 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 really smart, way smarter than me. So, maybe I can take a nod from them and just at least be open to the concept of these two things coexisting.
Just based on my kind of shallow understanding of, science as compared to someone like Albert Einstein or whatever, my study into those kind of fields, it's like the further you get into it, the more you realize, damn, this is a complicated ass place. Like there are forces we really do not understand. In any subject, I think the more you know, the more you realize you don't know, right? And so that's probably a factor at play too. I wanted to kind of switch gears a little bit and ask you, I guess this kind of ties in, I think, well, in fact, with spirituality, and that is doing meaningful work and what you're working on with that, how you're helping people with that, and kind of what your approach is for meaningful work.
Yeah, it's a great question, right? One of the things that I've become really aware of over the last decade or so, especially, is that meaning is a central role in our ability to feel fulfilled, feel a sense of peace of mind, to live good lives. Meaning is central, is really critical in our ability to live good lives. And if you've read, I know you've read Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. And for anyone who's listening who hasn't, I can't recommend that book enough. When you have a sense of meaning, kind of everything else works. When you have a sense of meaning, pain and suffering can exist in your life. But if you can understand how they fuel meaning or contribute to meaning, it completely changes the way you experience them. So I started to really realize, and there's great research now on meaning and how it changes us. If you think about it, the classic midlife crisis is an existential crisis, and an existential crisis, it's not a crisis of money. It's not a crisis of power. It's not a crisis of love. It's not a crisis of anything else. It's not a crisis of happiness. It's a crisis of meaning. Right? Because your existential means like you want to find meaning in your existence. So the thing that melts us down is when we have no meaning. You can live without all those other things that I've talked about. You cannot live without meaning on a sustained basis. Because if you don't have a sense of understanding, why you're here and that you're making meaning, yet your existence, the way you're contributing to the world has meaning, you will not be here for very long. So, I've become really fascinated because I think when you look at so many people and the way they're living their lives, especially they're doing their work in the world, whether that's the work they're paid for or just the work that they're doing because it's the work they're doing, there's not a really strong sense of meaning for most people. So I started really trying to understand, well, how do we get meaning? And meaning can come from a lot of different things in life, but meaning in the context of work is something that's sort of deeply fascinating to me. So the programming that we've done over the years, it's been largely focused on entrepreneurs, but we're really broadening it out now just to anybody who's trying to figure out how do I do work that lights me up, where I feel the sense of nourishment and meaning, where even if it's hard, even if I'm struggling, even if there's a certain amount of resistance and suffering that goes with it, there's a deep sense of meaning that keeps me saying, this is worth it. I feel really good about what I'm doing, even if it's hard and it's not coming easy and there's struggle involved. So a lot of it is kind of what we were just talking about, where so you're right, there is a really easy tie-in where, what I realize is that a lot of us don't find and do that work because in order to do that, we actually have to understand who we are and what matters to us and what gives us meaning and really what lights us up. There's sort of like this really interesting intersection that I found. If you thought of a Venn diagram with 3 circles, one circle is purpose. like having a strong sense of purpose in the work that you're doing. The second circle is flow, being able to feel flow while you're doing that work. And the third circle is expression, feeling like you as a human being, who you are, what matters to you, is fully expressed, and also the skill and craft that you have are being fully expressed. So if you take that Venn diagram, right, purpose, flow, and expression, and you find the overlap between those three, that's a state that I sort of loosely call sparked. And in that state is where we feel a profound sense of meaning, of purpose, of flow, of expression. And that is the magical place that we want to be able to spend as much time in the way that we contribute to the world. So if we can build our work, which is what most of us do during the majority of our waking hours, in a way that allows us to feel sparked, on purpose, deep in flow, and fully expressed, we will get meaning, we will get joy, we will get deep fulfillment, we'll get everything that we need from the way we contribute to the world. So this is all sort of like a fairly new synthesis of the work that I've been doing now for a very long time, and piecing it together in a way that really zooms the lens out and makes it applicable to a lot of different people. And this is sort of a lot of the work that we're building the whole archetyping system around for meaningful work as well. So that, to really just try and make it a lot easier for people to understand the self-knowledge part of it so that they can kind of hit the ground running faster. It's really exciting for me because, again, that bridges those two things. It bridges the maker in me and the scientist in me, and the ability to move people and help people live better lives.
So what would you say are the main components of, let's say, finding meaningful work for someone out there who maybe is not aligned with what they're doing, or what they're doing is not aligned with who they really are, whether that be a job or even a business they have? Like, what's the first step in kind of getting toward meaningful work?
Yeah, the first step is always self-knowledge. I won't say you can't find meaningful work or do meaningful work without self-knowledge, because you may just randomly stumble into something that just happens to completely align with who you are and what gives you a sense of meaning. But the first step really for most people, if you want to be able to create that on a sustained basis, is self-inquiry and self-knowledge. So that, do you understand who you are, what fills you up, what empties you out, what your deep values are, what your strengths are, what your sort of identity is, what your preferences are, your orientations. So you really understand these are the things that fill me up and empty me out. And then, you turn that out into the world and you look for things that essentially align as closely as possible with sort of the key elements about you. You brought up the big five before. Those are really interesting things to think about too. Where do you fall on the spectrum of the big five personality traits? And how can you align the work you do with them? And then what we know when we look at, purpose and meaning are not actually the same thing, but purpose certainly informs meaning. Meaning is the feeling that you get to. Purpose is the sort of the verb, the action that gets you there, purposeful work. When you look at the research on purpose, very often what we find is to do work that gives you a strong sense of purpose, it needs to be something that is actually a substantial reach. So, you're not going to get a really great sense of purpose by checking off a whole bunch of to-dos on your daily to-do list that, is simple, short, little things. We're talking about things that are bigger, that take concerted action over time and are a reach for you. Another part of that is doing things that are not entirely you-centric, doing things that in some way are in service of others. The research in purpose shows that tends to create a stronger sense of purpose in people. So those are, two really important key traits when you talk about purpose. And having a strong sense of purpose or, working toward a purpose is one of the things that can give you a deep sense of meaning. If you zoom the lens out and we're not just talking about work, but, what are the different things just in the world that give people a sense of meaning in a very general way? You look at some of the other research. Baumeister did some really interesting research on this. You include things like love, deep and meaningful relationships can be profoundly meaningful sources in your life for pretty much anyone. It's the classic work and love. That's what it does. And also looking at Viktor Frankl, and this is something that most people don't want to hear, but suffering, sacrifice. People try and avoid that like crazy, but that in the name of something that really matters to you can actually become a very strong source of meaning. If you work really, really, really hard and you give up other stuff to make it happen, and you do it in the name of something that really matters. There's some recent research that came out last year, actually, that showed that if you work a day job that's really not all that fulfilling, and you just work it because, you don't feel like doing something else, it's like better the devil you know, it's not going to really be all that meaningful to you.
Yeah.
But if you work a day job that's really not all that satisfying, and you are a parent to a family, or you have like a child or a friend in need, and you know that the reason you're doing this thing is because it's giving you the money to take care of other people who you love deeply and get them through, like make sure that they feel okay in the world, or get them through medical challenges or whatever it may be, that the level of meaning that you feel from that job actually goes up pretty substantially. So it's really interesting to sort of see the way that we can derive meaning from different things.
Oh, that's really interesting. I mean, I love your initial approach of just kind of getting self-aware, like self-knowledge and discovering how you're wired. I think that's a really powerful tool, self-awareness. I talk about sometimes like acting on your excitement, and there's practical reasons for that. It sounds a little woo-woo, but once you kind of unpack it, you start to realize, oh, this makes sense. But that philosophy kind of aligns with what you're saying, I think. When I say act on your excitement, I'm talking about like day to day, there's a thread that connects those things to kind of your larger path and purpose. But when I talk about this, sometimes people come back and they're like, sitting on the couch watching TV excites me, or, doing cocaine excites me. And some of that is just to be antagonistic, but like some of it also is valid. Like it comes from a genuine place. Like, well, this, excites me, but those people might be confusing kind of what excites you with distractions. And what you're saying, the part about kind of being self-aware, really helps to round out the advice of do what excites you, because you have to do that within the context of knowing yourself and of knowing what you're truly in your heart of hearts all about, and what you're aligned with. And if you kind of act on those exciting things and the things that spark you within that context, within the context of self-awareness, I think that's more powerful.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And if you think about, that person who's like, well, I want to go blow some coke for that's what makes me excited.
Right.
Or I just want to lie on the couch and watch TV every day. You're like, that's what I really love to do. On the one hand, I'm like, well, actually, if you're really deeply interested in storytelling and, like how TV works and stuff like that, and that could be legitimate. But
exactly.
if you're just blowing off steam and you're just killing time and you're just bored out of your mind, and this is how you decide to do it, what I would think about is two things. One is, how do you feel afterwards?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you've just been lying on the couch for 3 hours. How do you feel about yourself when you turn off the TV?
Right.
Oh, that was deeply nourishing. I'm so engaged and lit up with my life and my body and the way I'm feeling about everything. And that was time really well spent.
Right.
Or if you're out partying and you're doing drugs, how do you feel the next morning when you wake up? Is that really valuable time that was making you happy in the end? And then we can kind of zoom the lens out and look at research again. And there actually has been a fair amount of research done around what they would call sort of the difference between hedonic experiences and more deeply nourishing experiences. What they found is that most people actually think that, when they have time to kick back and just watch TV or do nothing or kind of let their brain melt a little bit, that's when they're the happiest. The research actually shows the exact opposite. People are actually report that they're much happier when they're actually really engaged, often working hard, often pursuing something that is deeply interesting to them. And it's counterintuitive because a lot of people are like, oh, I just want to go do nothing for the weekend. And in fact, the research shows that that is not the thing that actually puts you in your best place.
Yeah. And that aligns with kind of what I was saying earlier in how I anchor that in my mind is, okay, well, why are we wired like that? Is that just a random thing? Well, no, as we evolved as humans, we always had challenges. We always had things that we needed to do every day. We're in such a modern, soft environment where we can go to the supermarket and get some produce. We don't have to forage or hunt for our food, right? But these are challenges that we evolved to do on a daily basis, this kind of stuff. And so that anchors this idea for me. And then I can take in this information and be like, oh, okay, that makes sense why we need challenges and why we're not really wired to do nothing all day. That's why people go crazy in retirement sometimes. That's why you have to have a purpose. That's why meaning makes sense, because we've always had it evolutionarily. We need to create it in our lives now.
Yeah, really interesting sort of side note to this is that if you look at Olympic athletes, if you look at people who have set out to accomplish really big, hard goals, and they work really, really, really hard for years to accomplish them, and then they accomplish them, very often, right after they do it for a period of months, sometimes even years, they fall into a deep depression. And a big part of the reason is because they no longer wake up and have that sense of, okay, I know what I'm here to do. Like I have something that I'm working toward.
Yeah.
And it's really important. And look, I think neither of us are saying a little bit of downtime is a bad thing.
Right.
It's an awesome thing, right? But, it's like a threshold,
Totally.
where, if your life starts to become like, okay, this is my thing that I do every day, then that starts to become destructive and not productive. And I think we just kind of all have to be aware of that.
Yeah, I mean, I like to think of it as like anything in excess becomes its opposite. That goes for relaxing also. I wanted to ask you a few more questions and get your views on specifically the love languages. When I first read your book, How to Live a Good Life, you have a chapter on the love languages. And this is a framework that has really impacted my life in a positive way and something that I use on a daily basis with Vanessa, my wife, but also with the other people in my life, with my family and even friends. And I know you work with your wife just like I work with my wife. So, and we have similar kind of dynamics. Can you kind of expand on what the love languages are and how they interface in your life?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to. And let me preface by saying I'm definitely not an expert in the love languages, but I'll just kind of tell you how I experienced it. Love languages are essentially based around the idea that every person has some sort of baked in way that they want to experience love. We have a unique language where the way that we know somebody else loves us is when they speak our love language, when they tell us, not in the way that they want to tell us, but in the way that we need to receive it for it to land. So there are these 5 different languages. What I realize is that, just like you realize that sure, it's about your romantic partner, your life partner. It's about everybody. It's about your family. It's about your friends. It's about your business colleagues, because it's not just romantic love. It's also appreciation. So, for example, if somebody's love language is words of praise, right?
It's mine.
And awesome. Which is funny because I'm the exact opposite. That's like the one place that we diverge, right? Yeah. So like for me, words of praise mean nothing. It's not that it means nothing, but it's just, I'm like, oh, that's nice. It doesn't really do anything for me. For me, my language is much more like physical presence and touching. I like to receive love in the form of touch. Just hands holding while you're walking down the street, lying on the couch while you're reading together and you're kind of lying on each other, of just physicality and also just presence, like actually being present with someone. And for me, gifts and words of praise are, at the bottom. So like for me, gifts they don't do much. They're nice. To me, it just doesn't matter all that much. Whereas for you, if your thing is words of praise and I'm just like, constantly like wrapping an arm around you or being around you, but never saying it, you're eventually going to be like, well, this relationship is not working. You never like show me your love and anything like that. Yeah. I think it's just a really interesting framework to understand the way to express appreciation and love and gratitude to another person in a way that may not actually be the natural way that you would do it, but that lands with them so they really feel it. That's a really just valuable tool to have when you're trying to deepen into a relationship with anyone on any level.
Yeah, it's so valuable. And it's so simple too. It's like, okay, so the 5 love languages are physical touch, words of affirmation or words of praise, gifts, acts of service, and quality time. And so the idea is that you naturally kind of receive love in one of these ways or interpret love in one of these ways, just like a regular language. Just like if you were talking with someone who speaks French, you wouldn't try to just speak English to them because they wouldn't understand you. You would have to learn French, right? And so that's the idea, is like you want to learn somebody's love language and then learn how to speak it. this naturally happens at the beginning of relationships pretty organically, because at the beginning of relationships, you're throwing out all the love languages, like you're excited and everything's happening. But then as that dopamine wears off a little bit and you get years into it, you have to be more precise about how you show your love. And that's when really this framework I find is helpful, because you can then precisely show love. Like, for instance, Vanessa's love language is acts of service. I mean, it's like a hack almost, because the fact that I know her love language is acts of service, she actually has two. Acts of service is primary. Quality time is secondary. They're very close. They're neck and neck, right? It's like a hack when you know someone's love language, because we can be kind of just got over like a little bickering or something, which doesn't happen often. But anytime when I want to kind of just increase her affection for me, I will, like, let's say, go outside and sweep the porch. And I think that's silly as hell. Like, who cares? But she sees me doing it and she's like, oh, you love me? Like, she'll actually say that. She'll go, oh, you love me? That's cool. And so this is kind of a little, funny, thing we have, but it works, and by the same token, she knows how to just say things to me. Like, I am such a sucker for words of affirmation. Like, we went to London a couple years back. The culture there is such that people are just so polite. I think just on average, a little bit more polite than in the States. And they'll just say like nice things, and I loved it. Like, I love the culture there. And Vanessa's family like totally does not like words of affirmation, kind of like you. They think they're fake and they're empty. And so I was telling her family about this, and they're like, yeah, but don't you know that they're just faking it? Like, they don't really mean that. And I'm like, I don't care. I love it. So it works, man.
Yeah, I think it's just another tool to help us understand how to interact with other people in a way that doesn't just serve us, but actually serves them and listen. I mean, it's so funny, like the classic taking out the garbage could be, for the person whose like love language is an act of service, viewed as like an act of love or an act of, deep gratitude and appreciation.
Yep, exactly. Speaking of love, I also wanted to touch on your new podcast, and it's called Love Full Stop. What's that all about?
It is. Yeah, we're in sort of early production now. We just kind of pushed it back a little bit. It's scratching two itches for me. One is the maker itch. We've got a great podcast and an incredible community globally, but it's conversation driven. And I've wanted to do something that sort of was much more artistic and really highly edited and sound designed and beautifully produced. And I'm also fascinated by first person storytelling. So I wanted to create something that was really unique. And the other driver behind it is when you sort of look at what's happening in the media now, and mainstream media, but now increasingly in podcasting too, you'll see that a lot of it is driven by news and politics. And the story that's being told is all about rage, outrage, polarization, and separation. They're hard issues and hard conversations and actions that we need to have and we need to take. But at the same time, that's not the whole story.
Yeah.
That's half the story. The other half of the story is the story of amazing people doing beautiful things every day for each other from a place of love, and not just romantic love, but friendship love, familial love. So I said, I want to tell that side of the story. I want to tell the side of the story that is about love between humanity. Very often, like people of all different places, ethnicities, genders, persuasions, orientations, where they just do things from a place of selflessness, from a place of service, sacrifice, of love. I want to create this thing, let's tell the story of us through the lens of love. So we're in production with that right now and gathering stories for it right now to tell them in a really beautiful way so that, you can tune in to something on a weekly basis and not just get the rage and the outrage, the separation, but actually listen to a story where it may be somebody who you've perceived to be completely different from you in every way. But because they're telling a story about a circumstance that we all feel in some way, that is in some way fueled by love, we find ourselves reconnecting to our own humanity and also reconnecting to the humanity of others. We just really need that right now. So we're in production with that. It's going to be out at this point in late spring, but we are accepting stories too if anyone wants to submit. I'm super jazzed to create that and bring it out to the world soon.
Very cool. Yeah, that's much needed. And I agree with you. It's a little disheartening when you think about the polarization that's happening right now, but anything that helps to find common ground, I think is really welcomed. So I'm on board with that, and we will put the link to submit, people's stories on the show notes here. So I know you got to get back to your day. I had an awesome time talking with you, man, and thank you so much for sharing. Is there anything that you want to leave our listeners with, or any places where they can find you?
Yeah, well, first, thanks so much for having me on. It's been so fun just kind of watching you do your thing and becoming friends over a couple of years now. And I'm really excited for you with this podcast. And I so appreciate the invitation to just spend some time talking about cool issues. For anyone who's interested in finding me, probably the best place is just to go to goodlifeproject.com. Pretty much, that feeds to everywhere else. And we've got all the different social media accounts and stuff like that. You can find it all there. And then for anyone who wants to submit a story for Love Full Stop, you can just go to lovefullstop.com as well.
Awesome, man. Jonathan, thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Hey, thanks for listening to the Think Grow podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and find value in this podcast, I humbly ask you to please subscribe or leave me a review on iTunes. Or you can just share it with a friend who you think might find value in it. If you've already done any of these, I want to take a moment to sincerely thank you. I truly, truly appreciate your support. Lastly, if you have any suggestions for future guests or topics you'd like to hear covered, you can email podcast@thinkgrowprosper.org.